Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Thursday the 14th of October and this is Scotland at 7. I'm Andrew Wilson and this evening I'm presenting the programme from Edinburgh. First we will have today's coronavirus update, then I will introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we will discuss today's news headlines from Scotland and around the world. As of 2 p.m. today, since the start of the pandemic, a total of 3,297,384 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and the UK Government regional testing centres. Of these, 2,697,547 have been confirmed negative, and 599,837 have tested positive. There are 2,639 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms, and not all those with symptoms will be tested. I'm afraid to say that there are also 29 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 8,878. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 908 were in hospital last night, 50 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. this morning, 4,275,208 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 3,871,406 had received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures show that 138,237 patients who had tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, and that is an increase of 157 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just in hospitals. Now this evening we are lucky to be joined by a regular and eminent guest, Linda Fabiani. Linda was the MSP for East Kilbride and the Deputy Presiding Officer in our Parliament until she retired from that part of her career at the election in May earlier this year. She's also the only Cavaliere who I know of in Straven. So good evening, Linda. How are you keeping?
Good. I'm absolutely grand. Thank you very much, Andrew. Hello, everyone.
Well, it's great to see you and thank you for joining us this evening. Our first story is that the Boundary Commission for Scotland have today announced the start of an 8-week public consultation on their initial proposals for the 2023 review of UK Parliament constituencies. The Boundary Commission's proposals recommend reducing the number of constituencies in Scotland to 57, down 2 from the present number of 59. Constituencies must contain no less than 69,724 parliamentary electors, and no more than 77,062, except for the 2 protected constituencies of Nanealing and Yar and Orkney and Shetland. If necessary, the Commission can recommend a constituency with an electorate lower than the minimum if it is larger than 12,000 square kilometres, and no constituency can be larger than 13,000 square kilometres. Many constituencies have had their boundaries redrawn by the proposed changes, which seems certain to draw comment from local communities. Everyone can comment on the proposals at www.bcs2023review.com. So Linda, the starting point for me here is that the number of, in terms of these proposals which are now out for consultation, the number of Scottish seats will be reduced by 2, the number of Welsh seats will be reduced by 8, there'll be no change in Northern Ireland, and the number of seats in England will be increased by 10. Now, at a time when the Scottish population is growing, reducing the number of constituencies seems odd to me, and in particular, the Scottish population has grown significantly since I was growing up, and when I was growing up, there were 72 Scottish seats at Westminster. So what's going on here?
Gosh, I think there's quite a lot in this, actually, Andrew. The justification would be given by Westminster would be that, now there's devolved parliaments, assemblies and things, so there's better representation. From one point of view, the the first thing that always strikes me as someone who believes in an independent Scotland and as a nationalist is it's very hard for me to get upset about the idea of Westminster seats disappearing in Scotland because I want them all to disappear. So there's a bit in me says, well, so what? But then the other bit kicks in, which is about the inherent unfairness, that you've referred to. And that's about a whole UK problem. It's about lack of representation for smaller communities. When you consider that the Boundary Commission sits and looks at changes, all referring to population size, which means that the places with a bigger population are always better represented. And when you look at other legislators worldwide, they put things in place to make sure that smaller communities are well represented. Very quick example that comes to mind is the US, where states return senators, and the likes of, I think Montana returns two, and California returns two. And when you look at the population sizes respectively, it's about representation. But you have a system in the UK where London is overwhelmingly represented, not just in terms of how the boundaries are set, but overrepresented in terms of both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Because within that establishment round about London in the South East, that's where people are drawn from in the legislators in the United Kingdom. So it's a very unfair system, and it's particularly unfair to, we have common cause. For example, places in the north of England, the likes of Cornwall, South West. So there's common cause there. So for Scotland, as always, we just get dumped upon. I just wish people would realise it and realise that we could do a lot better if we were representing ourselves with no representation in Westminster. However, that's the system that's there. It is inherently unfair to smaller populations. And so many of the institutions of the UK are the same. To introduce a new subject, the BBC in how Scotland is grossly underrepresented in content there. So it's just part of the norm.
Part of the same problem, Linda. It certainly struck me when you were speaking there that does this reduction in the number of Scottish and Welsh seats and an increase in the number of English seats, is it just underlining or emphasising even more that in fact what Westminster is England's Parliament? It's not the national Parliament.
I certainly think. I always hesitate to draw it in these terms because we do have common cause with some communities in England. So I don't even think they see it as an English Parliament. I think they see it as a Parliament of London and the South East. Those who are drawn to the capital, those who are drawn to what they see as the seat of power, and they all look after each other. And I'm afraid, even the other UK parties that are not in government, Labour and the Lib Dems, they don't have any coherent policies that would address that. We hear a lot of talk about, we should go for proportional representation, we should do this, we should do that. But none of them have ever really looked at it seriously. And there's a real lack of representation for communities right across the UK. But certainly the likes of Scotland and Wales, I would say, as nations and recognised nations, as part of the four nations, are certainly being done down in this instance.
That's a good point that you make, Linda. And I was thinking also of it in terms of the representation aspect. I was thinking of these issues in Scotland in particular from the perspective of the representatives as well. One of the current Highland constituencies, one of them is roughly the same size as Wales in terms of the geography, and so to have one solitary representative covering a large area in which transport and communications are not communications in person physically going to surgery scattered, spread properly across the communities of the Western Isles, for example, or across the West Highlands, that it would be very easy to spend your whole life travelling uh,
Uh-huh.
from surgery to surgery and not do anything else. So is it
Mm-hmm.
a question here of, as you say, as you're suggesting, of a London perspective, which probably can't see over the horizon to the West Highlands, and so just has no understanding of the challenges that having constituencies of this geographic size brings?
Yeah, that's back to that old discussion of they just don't realise. Maybe they just don't care, looking after their own. Uh, it's certainly a big issue. I mean, I thought even in Parliament in Holyrood, uh, I used to think how fortunate I was that I had a very contained constituency in terms of East Kilbride. I had one
Yeah.
town with one little outlying bit to look after, and that's comparatively easy compared to, for example, Michael Russell, who had to cover the whole of Argyll and the islands. So we had a system that we had to adopt because that was what was agreed in the Constitutional Convention. But I would hope that an independent Scotland would start devolving power down from parliaments to communities because, I mean, when you look at Councillor Christine Curry, a Highland councillor, I had a discussion with her recently about her ward, Caithness. I mean, it's absolutely massive. And, it's a council ward, and she finds it really difficult to visit all the communities that are within it. So, an independent Scotland needs a big rethink about how people are represented. Unfortunately, I don't think UK government, opposition parties, establishment have any wish at all to revisit these things because it suits them perfectly the way it is.
No, absolutely. And Caithness is a very good example as well. I'm always reminded that there are more people in 1 square mile in central London than there are in the whole of Caithness. So, as you say, getting around and speaking to people in itself is a challenge. Now, I've seen some early and rough analysis of the proposed changes today, which suggested that the net outcome in terms of representation of the different parties at Westminster would be that the Lib Dems would lose 2 MPs. So in that sense, and on that analysis, and we don't know that this is only these are only proposals. They've not been consulted. They've not, and we've not had any elections. But if that was to happen, would the loss of 2 Lib Dem MPs make much difference at all in terms of Westminster politics or Scottish politics?
Well, when you look at the whole, I mean, even just to quote the Better Together campaign and to use Better Together as a slogan for anti-independence, no, it would not make much difference to Scotland because all they're all concerned about is working together to keep Scotland in the UK for their own ends. So I don't think it'll make much difference to Scotland at all. Do you know, I was really interested, Andrew. Douglas Ross is seemingly, the leader of the Scottish Tories, is seemingly up in arms about changes to his constituency, his Westminster constituency. And it really struck me, does that mean that he has always intended to double track at Holyrood and Westminster and have two jobs all the time and not give either of
Well,
them up? Because he seems to be really concerned about getting re-elected to Westminster.
That's a bit. Well, I suppose it's well, 3 jobs or arguably 4 jobs in his
Oh,
case.
I suppose.
If we add his principal job, which is running the line, and his second job, which is being the current leader of the Tories in Scotland. But
Mm,
certainly you're right. His constituency is to be divided into 3 and will disappear.
mm.
Now, I think it was suggested that he had said that he didn't intend to stand for Westminster again,
All
but
right.
that he but to your point, and I take your point, the extent to which, and it may just be that whenever he opens his mouth, he gets on the BBC, and that's maybe why we've heard this. But he certainly was protesting loudly this morning about the potential for his constituency to
Mm.
disappear. And so it does maybe give the lie to whether or not he does have an intention to continue to serve as MP and MSP. You would have thought that perhaps his ambitions at Westminster are maybe limited now, given that Malcolm Offord's been made the latest latest minister in the Scotland office,
Aye.
bypassing Douglas, who's clearly, well, I suppose that would have been a 5th job, and even for Douglas Ross, that's getting a wee bit out of control.
So maybe I'm misjudging the man. Maybe he's genuinely concerned about representation in his area. Maybe.
Well, I'm sure we'll learn more about that in due course. These consultations will go on for another year, and the changes will come into effect in 2023. So we will no doubt find out in due course what his true colours are regarding representative democracy in Mauritius. But we'll move on to our next story now, which is that the Scottish Government Finance and Economy Secretary, Kate Forbes, has met the UK Government's Chief Secretary of the Treasury, Simon Clarke, in London today to discuss the forthcoming review of Scotland's fiscal settlement. A statement following the meeting said that the UK Government and Scottish Government had agreed in principle the scope of the independent report that will inform the subsequent review of the Scottish Government's fiscal framework. In a meeting in Westminster, Ms Forbes and Mr Clarke agreed to commission an independent report on the block grant adjustment arrangements, including a call for stakeholder input, prior to a broader review of the fiscal framework. The ministers will confirm these arrangements in writing later. Now, Linda, this is preparation for a review of the framework. The meeting today wasn't talking about actual pounds and pence. And before the meeting, Kate Forbes said, "We have faced unprecedented economic and fiscal upheaval as a consequence of the pandemic and Brexit. As a result, Scotland's fiscal framework has been thoroughly tested and in some areas found wanting," which implies strongly that she sees areas in which the fiscal framework needs to change. So do you think that the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Simon Clarke, will see it the same way?
Well, I suspect he might agree that changes need to be made, but the question will be what changes Kate Forbes thinks should be made and what changes Mr Clarke thinks should be made. And I'm sure they'll actually be very different. I mean, I know that the Scottish Government, and I understand that the relevant committees of the Scottish Parliament have all agreed that what the Scottish Government needs are more powers and the flexibility to enable them to deal with unprecedented times, to be able to deal with things as they come up. I mean, Brexit has changed the whole landscape hugely. The pandemic, well, we all know what's happened there. So, but in normal times, there should still have been a review because this all came out of the Smith Commission. And then there was a committee that looked at this for a long time. And it was up against the wire getting the agreement made before the 2016 election. I think it was, from memory, it was at the last minute that John Swinney managed to get agreement. And so that's been 5 years. So it was always due for review. I just hope that it's looked at by Westminster with an open mind. But I'm really concerned because they have this propensity now and they're up in the ante on it, where they keep spending UK money and allocating some of it to the benefit of Scotland, and even at times very blatantly spending money that should be going through the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament for expenditure. So I'm concerned, although they'll agree the need for a review, it may not be in the same terms that Scotland's Finance Minister and indeed parliamentary committees think it should be.
Well, that's an interesting point that you open up there, Linda. During the Tory Party conference, we heard Michael Gove talking about specific plans for spending on road infrastructure in Scotland. That he was suggesting that spending would be made directly from Westminster, as you say, bypassing the Scottish government, and the prospect for the kind of chaos that would bring in all sorts of practical and legal and accounting ways certainly crossed my mind at the time. And as we know, not least because of the alacrity with which I'm trying to think of a positive word, the coalition in Aberdeen City Council, the alacrity with which they welcomed the news that apparently Westminster would fund them directly rather than through the Scottish government. Do you think? So? With that as a backdrop, do you think these discussions about the fiscal framework, so the principles, in a sense, do you think this is firstly, this is simply setting up another constitutional argument? And is it all, secondly, is it evidence again of a slightly tin ear in the cabinet, especially those who are apparently responsible for strengthening the union, that they just don't understand how this is going to play in Scotland?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there is a potential for that because I think that's where they start off from. Do they not understand how this will play in Scotland? I don't think they understand fully. I think they might be willing to take a chance. And it's really the Scottish Parliament has to step up and protect Scotland. Now, I know that the SNP will. I know that the Greens will. I know that the Tories won't, because they'll just bow down to everything that London says. And again, I'll come back to something that I'm always banging on about. The Labour Party really have to step up to the mark. I know that they're part of Better Together, but I also know that there's people there who are not quite sure about that policy ongoing. So I would like to see Anas Sarwar and his party in Scotland genuinely stand up for what's best for Scotland and put aside the politics of staying as part of the UK. Keep having that argument if they want, but don't sacrifice everything in Scotland on the basis of that argument. Start getting much more clever about how they do it. And I really think that common ground could be found with the Labour Party in protecting Scotland. Because whatever else I think about them, they were very, very active in the creation of a Scottish Parliament. You know, they've had people who've led them who were all for Scotland and sometimes did things against the UK government to stand up for Scotland. I would like to see some of that.
Well, that's also an interesting point that you make, reflecting the difference in the reporting and the manner in which Westminster and Holyrood operate at the moment. We see in Scotland the extreme politicisation of every single thing that is delivered by the Scottish government. So, if an ambulance in East Kilbride has a flat tyre, it's a resigning matter for Humza Yousaf. I'm exaggerating for effect, but that's the way in which it's dealt with by the opposition. But that's certainly the way it's handled by the opposition parties, and that's the way it's handled by the BBC. Now, it's speaking hypothetically here in terms of direct spending on infrastructure projects in Scotland by the Westminster government, in circumstances where, whenever there's a problem in the NHS in England and Wales, nobody ever asks for Sajid Javid or whoever's health secretary at the time to resign. So in terms of the democracy of this, in terms of democratic accountability, in the event that, speaking hypothetically, the Westminster government does embark on road building projects in Scotland and they overrun horrifically and overspend horrifically, which is something that Westminster projects have a habit of doing, where does that leave the democratic accountability for all of this? Because in Scotland there would be demands for ministers to resign, and in England and Wales there'll be nothing. So how could the Scottish people affect and give voice to their democratic dissatisfaction with inept implementation of projects by Westminster and Scotland?
That's a really interesting point, Andrew, and it's a difficult one because so often the reality of these issues is not well reported by the mainstream press and media. And folk get confused as to who's responsible for what. So it's really, really hard. And the way things are just now with the Conservative group in Parliament, certainly, I mean, I've sort of watched it from afar, and it's just like, as you see, everything. I mean, Nicola Sturgeon is responsible for absolutely everything that happens in the world as far as they're concerned at the moment. So they would, you know, the minute there is a problem where the responsibility lies at Westminster, they would start spinning furiously to make it look as if it was the Scottish Government that was somehow at fault here. And it's a really difficult dilemma for the Scottish Government as well, because on one hand, of course they, and indeed the Parliament in my view, should be fighting to say, if this is something that's a devolved matter, the responsibility should be ours, not yours. So on the one hand, they absolutely want the responsibility. and are willing to face up to the consequences of that responsibility. We've seen that many times. However, you've got a Westminster government which is two-pronged. They want, on one hand, when things go well, to be saying, look what we've done for Scotland. This is a UK government that has done that, because your Scottish government's rubbish, by the way. But then if it goes wrong, they will very quickly try to shift the blame onto Scotland. And it actually reminds me of how successive UK governments behaved with the European Union when we were members, because it was like every little bad thing that happened, they tried to shift the blame onto Europe and the Commission and all the rest of it. Whereas if the European Union did something good, like letting folk go on holiday with freedom of movement, like no roaming charges for mobile phones and stuff, the UK government tried to take full credit for that. Therefore, the population were actually not really au fait with what Europe was providing and some of the mistakes that the UK government made. And it's the same tactic they're using against the Scottish government, the Scottish Parliament, Welsh government and the Welsh Parliament. There's so much going on with the north of Ireland just now that they're not quite able to do that and don't deem it to be politic. But it's an ongoing problem that we have, is how to get that message over. And far too often, it's the wrong message that's put out there mainstream.
Absolutely. Well, we try and get the right messages out on Broadcasting Scotland, so we'll keep working hard at it.
Mm-hmm.
Our next story this evening is that the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, addressed the Arctic Circle Assembly in Reykjavik, Iceland today. She talked about Scotland's links with Arctic nations and how all countries must work together to tackle the climate emergency. Other speakers included the Prime Minister of Iceland, the Danish Minister for Foreign Affairs, and the EU Commissioner for Environment, Oceans and Fisheries. Ms Sturgeon told the Assembly the most northerly part of Scotland is closer to the Arctic Circle than to London. The First Minister also engaged in a series of bilateral meetings, including with the EU Commissioner for Environment, Oceans and Fisheries, Virginijus Sinkevicius, to discuss COP26 and the Edinburgh Declaration on Biodiversity, as well as the new EU Arctic policy. So, Linda, Scotland has several hundred years, if not longer, of history of trade and travel across the Nordics.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Iceland was originally populated with people who had been expelled from Norway, along with their Scottish slaves who went with them. So, thinking about global politics or European politics, how important do you think it is that our collective gaze is diverted northwards once more and directed towards our Arctic partners, in contrast to how it's been for the last maybe 100 years?
Well, I've long believed that, Andrew. It's worried me for years, not just the looking to London, but generally how the UK always looked to the United States of America as well, as opposed to looking to much nearer neighbours in mainland Europe. So I've often felt that, and one of the things that I was really pleased about when the SNP took government in 2007 was how we started to engage again with those to the north of our country, because our history really shows that. I mean, I remember once, some years ago now, I can't remember how long ago, I was really privileged to be asked to go and speak at an event in the Arctic Circle up in Svalbard, which is a strange session worth talking about sometimes. I can't really go into it just now about how Norway deal with Svalbard, but I was up there and I remember being absolutely fascinated because I went to the Svalbard Museum and it was full of references to Scotland. Ancient maps that were up on the wall showing the links, the trading links between Scotland and Svalbard, and then going on to the north of Canada, for example. Huge links with Orkney, particularly. Shetland too, but particularly Orkney, because Orkney seemingly was a stopping off place for the boats. So the history was absolutely fascinating. And I think there's not just the environmental issues, because of what's happening in the Arctic Circle. It's a real problem up in the Arctic. But I think Nicola Sturgeon has got a handle on the potential economic issues as well. So you've got the environmental issues, the economic issues. We have the friendship issues that are there as much as anything, and security issues. There's an awful lot in there that we should be dealing with the Nordic countries and the Arctic Circle. And I'm really, really pleased to see how well Scotland's First Minister is received at such events and hugely respected for the work that Scotland is doing through the Scottish Government. So, yeah, I'm all for it. We really have to start looking further afield, looking back to our history, seeing where we were and where we can be.
Absolutely, Linda. Thank you. And certainly, I remember that the traditional name for the timber industry in Norway is the Scottish industry, because so much of the timber was exported to Scotland. So long history, and we're looking forward to maybe exploring these things. And I'm sure you and I will be talking about this topic sometime pretty soon. But meanwhile, actually staying in Norway, a bow and arrow attack in which a Danish convert to Islam is suspected of killing 5 people in a Norwegian town appears to have been an act of terror, the police have said today. Investigators named the suspect as Espen Andersen Braathen, a 37-year-old living in Kongsberg municipality, where the attacks took place last night. A police attorney told reporters that Braathen had acknowledged killing the victims. His lawyer confirmed only that Braathen was cooperating with police and giving a detailed statement. Police had been concerned about signs of radicalisation in the suspect before the attacks, carried out with a bow and arrow and other weapons, a senior officer said. Flags flew at half-mast across Kongsberg after the deaths of 4 women and a man, all aged between 50 and 70. 3 others, including an off-duty police officer, were also injured. Braathen was in custody and was believed to have acted alone, the police said. A court will decide on Friday how long police can keep him in custody. So, as you would expect, first of all, the families and friends of those who were killed are at the forefronts of our minds this evening. But Linda, the person accused of the attack was arrested and is in custody. And I'm minded that the other mass murderer in recent Norwegian history, Anders Breivik, was also captured alive and it is in jail. Now, when I wonder what is different about the approach in Norway in comparison to the UK, where attackers in what appear to be similar circumstances are now almost always shot dead by the police at the scene and never stand trial.
That's not an aspect that I had considered, Andrew, but it's an interesting one. I mean, can I say, first of all, that what happened there, it's an act of terror, regardless of the motivation, regardless of what has caused radicalisation. I mean, you could say Anders Breivik was radicalised as well, in a different way that the Western world has started to talk about radicalisation. I hadn't thought of what you've been saying. Is there a difference in approach? I don't know. I suppose there's always, surely in both forces, in both countries, it's about trying to stop any further killing, however they do it. And I guess split decisions have to be taken as to whether you should kill or whether you try to capture. Were the circumstances different? I do not know. I do not know. I would hesitate to give any real opinion in that one, Andrew, because I don't know enough about the individual circumstances of what was happening at the time. I suppose he was using a longbow in this instance, I understand. Perhaps not as instantly able to be fatal as a gun would be. I don't know.
Well, I'm sure, Linda, as the facts begin to emerge properly, we can come back to this. But it certainly struck me that we've seen several inquiries subsequent in the UK But in each occasion, the accused or the person who's considered to have been responsible hasn't participated in any judicial process because they were shot. But we'll think about this from a different perspective and a more
Yeah.
and not focusing on the particular circumstances in Kongsberg last night, but to think more generally. We know that there's almost about to be a new Norwegian government come to power. I think either over the weekend or next week, and the closeness of this terror attack to a change in government in Norway brought to my mind also the murder of the Batley and Spen MP Joe Cox immediately before the Brexit referendum. And I was wondering whether you felt that Thomas Mayer, who murdered Joe Cox, Anders Breivik, who I would agree is equally as radicalised as any Islamic radical, and possibly this character Espen Andersen Brathen, do you think that there's a similarity there? Are they attempting to achieve the same notoriety? Are they attempting to have the same impact by their acts of terror? And I think yes, the Norwegian government's changing today actually.
Right. Oh, you could spend a long, long time trying to understand what motivates any of that stuff. That wish to kill people, harm people. And I guess it's like if you have never felt a wish or a need or any desire at all to ever do anything like that, it's very hard to try and get yourself into the mindset of someone who would. Do they want notoriety? Perhaps. Do they believe in an afterlife of some sort where they will be held up as heroes somewhere? My goodness. Or is it a form of derangement in some way that makes them think that they're doing the right thing and that they will be a martyr, a hero? But it's the randomness of it so often that gets me too. Like Anders Breivik with these children, innocents, like people who actually don't know who they're killing. All these shotgun incidents in the US where they go out and kill people that they've been with every day. Constant mystery to me.
Absolutely, Linda. I'm sure, as I say, as more details emerge from Kongsberg, we'll return to this story in due course. But we'll move on to the next item for this evening, and that is that a Conservative police commissioner accused of victim blaming in the wake of the murder of Sarah Everard has resigned after being told that there was a catastrophic lack of confidence in his position. Philip Allott, who oversees North Yorkshire Police and the region's fire service, was criticised after he said women need to be streetwise about the powers of arrest and should just learn a bit about that legal process in case they were approached by officers. His remarks were made in a radio interview following the sentencing of Everard's killer, the Metropolitan Police Constable Wayne Cousins, who had used his handcuffs and warrant card to abduct the 33-year-old from a South London street. In an extraordinary meeting of North Yorkshire's Police, Fire and Crime panel on Thursday, Allott admitted making a major mistake in a car crash radio interview, but he refused repeatedly to resign despite a unanimous vote of no confidence from the 11-member panel. However, 3 hours after the meeting, he announced his intention to quit. Allott's Conservative colleagues had lined up to tell him to resign during the 90-minute meeting. Mike Chambers, a Tory councillor, described the remarks as indefensible. Allott had also faced a growing chorus of criticism since his comments 13 days ago, including from Boris Johnson, Priti Patel and Keir Starmer. Demands for his resignation grew this week when colleagues accused him of making sexist and misogynistic comments to female staff, allegations he denies. Now, Linda, various members of the Police and Crime panel for North Yorkshire described his comments as incredible and unforgivable. So, firstly, do these events, does this interview and his reaction and his response and the way in which this is played out, does this suggest to you that the policy of appointing political police commissioners in England and Wales, that it attracts political folks who shouldn't really be in the job?
No, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I've never agreed with the way they appoint police commissioners, but having said that, we see from all the studies that have been done and what's come out is that there is a misogyny within the Metropolitan Police in particular, from what I understand, though no force is exempt from it. Um, so that is an issue, and it's fundamentally an issue about there are people in power in all walks of life that have unacceptable views on many things. I mean, what that fellow said in that interview, you described it as a car crash interview. My goodness, it certainly was. Absolutely astounding that somebody in that position had these views and aired them. Uh, it was awful. And of course, he should have resigned. He should have resigned straight away. Completely unacceptable. And there's others too, that have said things that are not on, I understand. And there's still investigations going on about the level of complaints within forces of a sexual harassment nature. But we've had police officers talk about the misogyny that's inherent in many branches of the forces. So, yes, it's a big issue. And yes, he should have resigned. And there should be a lot of people taking note of that and rethinking some of the things that they believe, that they say. On the other hand, there was Police Scotland have put out a new campaign, which rather than telling women to be careful, are saying to men, your behaviour is unacceptable. It's not on. Have a good look in the mirror at yourself. I can't remember what they've actually called the campaign, but I looked at the opening video today and I was well impressed by it. So they've set off on the right track. So I'm really pleased. There's problems in Police Scotland, can't be denied. We know that. However, from the top, they had very quickly came out and with ways in which women approached by a lone police officer could have a degree of confidence, and they followed it up very quickly with this promotional video saying, right guys, take a look at yourself because it's your responsibility. So I'm really, really pleased to see that. And I noticed that Rape Crisis Scotland have very much welcomed it as well. So I hope that that campaign really takes legs and gets out there to everybody.
Great. Thanks, Linda. We'll move on to our next story now, and that is that the UK government is expected to back down over temporary visas for foreign butchers, as the food industry said ministers were beginning to listen to its warnings about the impact of staffing shortages. The expected intervention comes several weeks after farmers began culling healthy livestock because of a lack of staff in abattoirs where the animals are meant to be killed and processed. A backlog of as many as 120,000 pigs were estimated to have been stranded on farms long after they should have gone to slaughter, with pens now becoming overcrowded and farmers forced to call in specialist teams to dispose of the surplus animals. The meat industry is one of many sectors of the UK economy struggling with labour shortages created following Brexit and exacerbated by COVID-19. A lack of HGV drivers has also disrupted supply chains. The National Pig Association said it had received unconfirmed reports that the government was set to issue a number of temporary visas to allow processors to employ foreign nationals in abattoirs to help with the processing of the backlog of pigs on UK farms. The food industry will be watching closely to see whether measures announced remove the requirement for trained butchers from abroad to speak fluent English. According to the British Meat Processors Association, non-UK workers account for two-thirds of a workforce that is currently missing 15% of the 95,000 people the meat processing industry usually employs. Reports have suggested that about 1,000 temporary visas could be made available. So, Linda, firstly, we know that there was an offer of temporary visas made for HGV drivers to come to the UK, and that is reported to have attracted the sum total of 27 applications to fill the estimated 100,000 vacancies. So, do you think it'll be the response from foreign butchers to come and work in the UK, potentially to be sent home on Christmas Eve like HGV drivers? Do you think this will be any different?
No, it just stuns me. It's not that long ago they were saying all these people coming here and taking our jobs, and now they're like, please come and take these jobs. And it's just such blooming chaos. And why would anybody want to come back, or indeed come for the first time to, the UK, who've said we don't want you here? Beat it. It's it's just ludicrous. But so, I think too of how Boris Johnson reacted to the questions he had about the pig farming industry. When he was questioned on TV recently, this complete callousness that he displays in so many ways. There's absolutely no caring. And then we had reports today, was it, I can't remember who said, but Dominic Cummings had said to somebody, reported, or somebody had reported that I'll tell you who it was. It was Ian Paisley Jr. has said on TV that he was told by Boris Johnson that the Northern Ireland Agreement could just be opened up again and ignored. So there's a complete lack of any integrity in anything they do. And I'm thinking now it goes further. We've moved from get Brexit done, which was the big phrase, to let's keep Brexit going, because this is never ending. And you wonder how much of it is a smokescreen for all the other bad things that are happening in this government, because everybody's talking about, the effects of Brexit and missing so much that the UK government is doing. And there's another bit of me that's really cynical and thinks, are we going to have Boris standing up before too long, having come up with some solution, save the pigs, save Christmas, and he's going to be a national hero? Do you know, sometimes I think it's just too incompetent to be incompetence. And I'm thinking, is there some Machiavellian plan going on here? Because it's just ludicrous.
And it seems never ending as well. So I'm pretty confident that you and I are going to be discussing more examples of the conduct and the attitude both of the Prime Minister and his government as Brexit continues to pay bonus after bonus, especially to the people in Scotland. But I'll move on to the next item now, which is that companies bidding to win Scottish Government contracts will have to pay the real living wage. This will ensure that public sector contracts tackle in-work poverty and promote fair work practices across the public, private and third sector, where there is a risk of low pay. The real living wage has been consistently higher than the UK national living wage and helps create an inclusive and fair economy for all. The Business Minister Ivan McKee said, "We want to use every opportunity possible to promote fair work and ensure people are paid at least the real living wage. By using procurement powers to ensure bidders pay the real living wage, the Scottish Government is leading by example to help influence employment practices and embed fair work principles." So, Linda, is this step announced by Ivan McKee today, which will put more money into local economies through people spending their wages on food and other essentials, is this an indication of a different approach being taken at Holyrood when compared to Westminster? We know now that the approach in Westminster, as we've seen during the pandemic, is that procurement largely is used to put money into the offshore bank accounts of friends and families of Tory ministers and their donors.
Yeah, it's a tale of two governments, quite clearly. And I was absolutely delighted to see this today, because I know that it's been a few years now that the Scottish Government has been working really hard to find out a way of being able to do this. The will has always been there, but there's been concerns, about the use of procurement in this way, and they've been trying desperately to find a way to make this happen for public service contracts. So I'm absolutely delighted that this has now been put in place. I suspect it'll be challenged. Like so many things, we may end up with a court case somewhere. I hope not, but it certainly could happen, because there's been varying legal opinions on whether this can be done. So I'm delighted to see that Ivan McKee and the Scottish Government have said, no, we're doing this because it's the right thing to do. It's a moral obligation as far as I'm concerned. And the government should be doing that. and should also be doing everything they can to make sure that the private sector, third sector and private sector follow suit. Which is quite difficult because that's a reserved matter to Westminster when it comes to wages and things, as we all know. So good on them. And I noticed there was a subtext to that as well, which is that early next year they're also looking at putting specific conditions in Scottish Government grants, which I know they've also been working on, which is also long overdue, the ability to be able to do that. So yes, a tale of two governments. Absolute will there to be doing the right thing by the Scottish Government. I'm sure the Parliament will back that up. Well, I'm sure most of the Parliament will back that up. So, yeah, great stuff. And let's see more of that. And let's stand firm when any challenges come forward.
Thanks, Linda. And one other slightly subtext I was going to ask you about quickly as well was that the payment of the real living wage under Scottish Government contracts was a significant point in the Butte House Agreement, the cooperation deal struck between the Scottish Government and the Scottish Greens. So do you think is this an announcement of a change in procurement policy? Is it an indication to us that the Butte House Agreement is now being delivered and is starting to work?
I certainly think that's an element of it. I think, in the last Parliament, there was the will to be able to do that. But I think since the election, and now we've got the cooperation agreement with the Greens, I think there's a much firmer base of agreement within the Scottish Parliament that we can move forward with, and I think that's starting to show. So yes, good on both parties to that agreement here, because this is such an important issue.
Thanks, Linda. And now we'll move to our final story for this evening, which is that a project to help remove harmful litter in our seas and raise awareness of its environmental impact is set for expansion after receiving £180,000 of funding from the Marine Fund Scotland. The Fishing for Litter scheme is part of an international movement to support removal of marine litter from fishing areas and raise awareness of the damage done by marine litter with the fishing industry, local communities, and school children. The project also works to encourage improvement of waste management practices within the fishing industry. First launched in Scotland in 2005, the scheme has grown to include 20 harbours with more than 280 fishing vessels, collecting 1,844 tonnes of marine litter. The voluntary project has set ambitious targets for the coming year of landing at least 150 tonnes of marine litter, recruit at least another 30 member fishing vessels, and add a minimum of 3 participating ports. The funding will be used to cover waste collection and disposal, staff costs, and education materials. Announcing the funding at Eyemouth Harbour, one of the 20 Fishing for Litter ports, the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs, Barry Gudgeon, said that marine litter is a global challenge and the Scottish Government is working nationally and internationally to address it. Ms Gudgeon said, "This funding demonstrates our commitment to reducing plastic pollution as part of a suite of wider measures, which includes action on single-use plastic products." So, Linda, firstly, do you think that this funding will be able to support and encourage sufficient behavioural change in the fishing industry? Now, here I'm thinking in particular of the northeast pelagic fleet. I'm not thinking of the West Coast fleet. My recollection of operations on North Sea trawlers and Atlantic trawlers, the larger vessels in the past, was very much that everything was thrown into the sea. So do you think we're going to see sufficient behavioural change now as a result of this additional funding?
I think it was already starting to happen. This is just an expansion of what was currently there, and it's been getting worked up for a lot of years now. So I think the fact that it's an international cooperation agreement, that it's more likely that those who have not had that care will start to feel obliged to have that care. As I say, it's already been happening. I don't know an awful lot about it, but I do remember from the last Parliament discussion on this and how improvements had been seen. And it's part of other initiatives too. It doesn't just stand on its own. So it's part of other initiatives in relation to the fishing industry, and the industry itself doing some stuff there too. And it ties in with the recognition across society that marine litter is just awful, and the damage that it can do. But it's only part of the wider environmental action that's been taken generally right across the world on so many things. Harder for different parts of the world. I mean, it's for the richer nations like ourselves in the West, it's easier to be saying, oh yes, we'll do this and do that because it's the right thing to do. But absolutely every bit helps. And I think it's only in comparatively recent years that the recognition of the problems of marine litter have become so big. And that, along with all the things we're doing, that are all going to be discussed at COP26 when it comes to Glasgow in a couple of weeks' time, I'm sure will help towards, in some way, making the future better for those that come after us, because that's really important. Fishing industry gets a lot of stick, but I think they have to look at self-interest too, and recognise, not just in terms of marine litter, but in terms of marine waste, in terms of overfishing and everything else. If it's going to be a sustainable industry, despite Brexit, it's another subject, but it's going to be a sustainable industry for the future. Notice has to be taken of these issues.
Thank you, Linda. And that was our final news item this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. If you would like to support us, and we would really like you to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland, and you will find the link to do that on the screen now. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work and promotes the station, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. Meantime, we will be here at the same time tomorrow for the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in then. I'd like to say thank you to everyone for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland this evening, and of course, a very special thanks to our very special guest, Linda Fabiani. So that's the way it is at very nearly Scotland at 8. I hope that you have a very peaceful evening.